This is part of our fight against infection unit, and it'd fall under the disease and infection nominated topic. This is the story of how one of the world's deadliest and most destructive diseases was overcome by a doctor from Gloucester, Edward Jenner, with the help of the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey. I'm just going to allow my friend Andrew Marr just to introduce us to this topic.
Now, these days there are ferocious arguments about the ethics of using animals for medical experiments. In Jenner's time, simply snaffling a working-class boy and using him seems to have caused no comment at all. Luckily, young James recovered. He had achieved immunity. And so, in this house, there had taken place the world's first vaccination. Vaccination comes from the Latin for cow, vacca. Unlike Galileo, Edward Jenner lived in a society where ideas were free to whirl around. His book explaining vaccination was a huge bestseller. The good news spread everywhere. Napoleon vaccinated his whole army and gave Jenner a medal. In America, President Jefferson vaccinated his household, and Jenner's discovery was soon saving lives all around the world. Almost 200 years later, in 1980, the World Health Organization announced the complete eradication of smallpox. It's still the only human disease to have been wiped off the face of the earth. During Jenner's lifetime, politicians were declaring the rights of man. It was a period of extreme political violence where on the continent tens of thousands died in the name of liberty. And yet Edward Jenner, a true child of the Enlightenment, using nothing more than his own powers of observation and the freedom to publish and discuss and test ideas, did more for human happiness than all the politicians put together. No human being who has ever lived has saved more lives in history than the simple country doctor from Gloucestershire.
So it's quite an amazing story. Let's break that down. So it's the 18th century and smallpox has taken over from the plague as the major killer disease. Victims would suffer from a high fever and the development of these sores that pus and produce a pus-type substance, and they appeared all over the body and developed over a series of days, as you can see from this picture. If the heart, brain and lungs became infected, then death was certain. Some survivors, if you were lucky enough to survive from this disease, you'd be left disfigured or scarred from the pock marks, and in some cases patients and sufferers were left blind. As you can see from this diagram, fatality rates range from between 15 to 50%. This was a deadly disease. So the old ideas and the traditional ideas led to a technique called inoculation. Many attempted to protect themselves against smallpox through this risky practice of inoculation. This involved taking the pus from the sore of someone who had caught the mild form of smallpox. The hope being that they themselves would only contract the mild form and be protected against the more severe and deadly form. In many cases, this backfired and the more aggressive form of smallpox took hold and the person died. This technique had been introduced to Britain by Lady Montagu. She was the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey, and while she was there, she saw a small cut be made into patients' arms, and a thread which had been soaked in the pus from a smallpox sore would be passed through that cut. When she returned and told people about this technique, it became very fashionable in Britain, and inoculation houses were set up in several parts of the country. So in comes this Gloucester doctor, Edward Jenner, who had studied under the famous surgeon John Hunter, from whom he'd learned the importance of observation and experiment. He was aware actually of a local belief that milkmaids who contracted a mild disease known as cowpox never caught the full-blown dreaded smallpox disease. And in 1796 he decided to experiment. Now, as Andrew Marr has just said, and unbelievably to us now, Jenner tested his theory by infecting an 8-year-old boy by the name of James Phipps. He infected him with the pus from a milkmaid's cowpox sore. The boy developed cowpox in the days that followed, and when he recovered, Jenner then gave him a small dose of the deadly smallpox. If the experiment worked, little James would be well. If not, he would die. But thankfully the boy survived, and Jenner had developed a way of protecting people against the deadly disease without the risky process of inoculation. He called his new technique vaccination, from the Latin word for cow, vacca. Now, amazingly to us now, many people opposed this technique and didn't like it, either because they were making a lot of money from inoculation or because they did not respect the idea of a little-known country doctor. However, when some members of the royal family were vaccinated, when Napoleon vaccinated the whole of his army and granted Jenner with a Medal of Honor, and even a group of Native Americans travelled all the way to Britain to thank Jenner, people started to take note. Jenner was given money from the government to develop this theory further, and in 1840 vaccination was made free for all infants in Britain. Jenner was years ahead of his time, and it was 80 years before another vaccination was discovered.